Hey everybody, welcome to a very windy fall Kentucky day here in LaGrange. I'm getting ready to throw on some more syrup on these hives. I've been feeding pretty heavy 2-to-1 syrup the past, I'd say about the past month. These hives were pretty light after I pulled the honey supers, and so going into the fall time period, I want to make sure that I really provide a lot of feed for these hives going into the winter time to make sure that they have enough food stores to get them all the way through the winter and into the spring. So I thought I'd take you guys along for the ride so you can kind of see the syrup that I'm feeding and just kind of tell you some of the reasons on why we feed this time of the year and exactly kind of what mixture of sugar to water that we feed as well. So here we go. Okay, so it is mid-October here in Kentucky, October 14th. And so, like I said, I've been doing a lot of feeding on these 10 hives after I removed the honey supers for the summer harvest and honey pull and started my mite treatments. I immediately started feeding syrup. And at that time, it was a lighter syrup, a 1-to-1 syrup. And as the temperatures start to get colder, and here in Kentucky, we're just now starting to dip down into the 30s and the 40s, you want to start feeding a heavier syrup. And that's what's in here. So this is actually a 2-to-1 syrup, which means 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. And the reason why we feed the heavier syrup in the fall time going into the winter is because it's much easier for the bees to dry out. And what I mean by that is to reduce the moisture content, just like they would do with nectar in the springtime when they're storing the honey in the frames, the nectar into the frames and curing it into honey, and they end up capping it. The bees are trying to get that moisture content down so that the sugar or the nectar or the honey doesn't end up fermenting on them, and so that it lasts all winter long as their primary food source to help them make it through the wintertime. And so each one of these hives right now, if you watched my last video on the Vivaldi boards, they have what's called a Vivaldi board on them, and that's what this is. And the real nice thing about these Vivaldi boards, other than their primary function being what's known as a quilt box or a hot box to help get your bees through the cold winter months, they also can act as a nice box to provide sugar water syrup feeding throughout the fall time period. And so these are those feeders that I've shown in other videos. Forget what they're called. Like I said, I had a link in one of my other videos. They're on Amazon. They're actually labeled as a hummingbird feeder, which again, I don't understand why, but they hold the sugar syrup in here very nicely. They don't hold a ton, but they hold enough. And you probably can't see right now, but the bees are going absolutely crazy. Let me go ahead and bring you in just so you can see what it looks like. They're going absolutely nuts on this sugar right now because we are in an extreme dearth period right now. It actually hasn't rained significantly in Oldham County, Kentucky in probably over a month. We got a little rain a couple days ago, but it wasn't hardly anything. And you can see the bees just going nuts there. And you can see the sugar syrup down here. I filled this up to the top less than 24 hours ago, and they've already taken that much down. And so I'm going to continue to keep adding more of this 2-to-1 sugar syrup to the hives so they can continue to build up their food storage in preparation of the winter. And so that's what I'm doing now with the bucket. And towards the end of this video, or maybe at the beginning of the video, I will show you how I make this. It's relatively easy. You just make it on your kitchen stove. And I just bought I think this is a 2-gallon bucket off Amazon. It's food grade plastic, BPA free. And I just drilled a hole in the side here and bought this food grade plastic spigot, screwed it in here, and it works great. beekeepers that have a much larger operation than myself, I mean, say like my buddy Don, who has like 70 or 80 hives, or I think Dave Hansberry has even more than that. You need a method to be able to feed this sugar syrup to a lot of hives relatively easily and quickly. So they have like automated systems where they have giant drums full of sugar syrup, where they have a pump, and then they can just drive around and fill each one of their hives with the sugar syrup. And there's different ways to feed your bees as well. I could do an entire video on how to feed bees and the benefits of feeding internally like this versus feeding externally, which in my opinion is not a good idea, especially this time of year. You're absolutely going to set off robbing. You've seen those feeders that hook into the front entrance of the hives. Now on these Apame bottom boards, you couldn't use those. As you can see, the front here has those holes in the plastic sliders. You couldn't use those, which I never use them anyway because I think they're a horrendous idea. And it's a good way to have all of your hives here start attacking each other and creating, you know, World War III within your apiary. So I just refuse to do that. So from day one beekeeping, I only feed internally. And that's solely to prevent robbing. Now, there's lots of different ways to feed internally, and you can find your feeder of choice. You know, watch other YouTube videos, do some research online, look on Amazon, look on Man Lake, Kelly Bees, any other online beekeeping store, and there's lots of different ways to feed your bees. I just really like this one, and when used in conjunction with the Vivaldi boards, it's kind of a no-brainer. And as you can see right now, I can come out here in my shirt and, you know, t-shirt and shorts and easily refill all of these feeders with relatively little effort here. And I don't have to suit up or nothing, you know, unless the bees are attacking and fighting each other, like what happened to me the other day when I got stung right in the face. I didn't realize I was walking into a war zone over there. One of my hives was getting robbed out. And that's, you know, having the entrance down to like an inch, 2 inches, and only feeding internally, it was still getting robbed out. So, you know, it happens. It's something that we have to deal with as beekeepers. It's not fun, but, you know, it's just one of those things with beekeeping, something that you always have to be cognizant of. It's not typically an issue in the springtime. It's more of an issue like right now when it hasn't rained in 30 days and we're in a dearth, which is a term that means there's very little nectar or natural sugar resources for the bees and the pollinators to find right now. So right here, I have a yellow jacket already landing on this, freeloading and taking a drink of the sugar water. So, and the yellow jackets are bad right now. A lot of beekeepers are having to fight with the yellow jackets in their apiary. You just kind of shoo them out of the way. They're a-holes and they will sting. They're probably one of the most aggressive stinging insects in Kentucky, especially if you get near one of their nests in the ground. They will tag you multiple times. Just ask people that do lawn care. But yeah, we switch over to a heavier syrup going into the late fall time period when temperatures are not consistently below freezing, but they are, there's another yellow jacket. They're not consistently below freezing, but they're just right above it. So, you know, 30 to 40 degree time frame, you want to switch over to that heavy syrup. And I've got wasps, I've got yellow jackets, 3 of them now already in here. And you switch over until the temperatures consistently stay below freezing, and then we'll switch over to a solid form of feeding. So sugar cakes, there's all sorts of recipes you can find out there. I'll be sure to post one, or I'll do another video on making up the sugar cakes that I will end up using inside these Vivaldi boards when I pull these syrup feeders out and replace them with the internal wooden square that has number 8 hardwire cloth on it. I think I showed you that in the Vivaldi board video. but I will replace these with those, and that's when you switch over to the solid form of feeding. Got 2 yellow jackets in the syrup, and so I'm going to get these a-holes out. And smash 1 and smash 2. They're just a giant nuisance. I mean, quite frankly, I'm sure the bees have to deal with it, way more than I do, but they're just annoying. And like I said, they're mean too. So, but yeah, once it starts getting really cold out, that's when you want to switch over to the solid, sugar cakes, or some beekeepers use what's called a fondant. If you switch over to solid food too early and it's not super cold outside, you can actually find your bees carrying that fondant and that sugar cake out of the hive and not even using it, which obviously completely defeats the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish. And so, another question that I'll get is, okay, well, I get it, Josh, you want to feed your hives and you keep adding the sugar syrup whenever they take it down. But how do you know when enough is enough and when do you stop? Well, every hive is different and every location is different. I don't know where you live, but here in Kentucky, our winters don't get extremely cold. We'll get down into the teens, the 20s. It's not very often we get below 0 here in Kentucky, but it can happen. And as a result, you really only need, I don't know, I've had hives successfully over winter that only had maybe 40, 50 pounds of food going into the winter here. And also keep in mind, because I use these Vivaldi boards, I feed throughout the winter also. So it's not like I'm feeding these hives in October, November, and then I'm shutting them up and I'm not doing anything with them until March. That's not the case. Because with these Vivaldi boards and that inner square that I'll show you later, I can come out here in the middle of December, the middle of January, and I can put a sugar cake in here, or I can put pollen substitute or a pollen patty, fondant if I wanted to. There's this mixture that I use that's got, I think Laura sent me the recipe, but it's got pollen substitute in it, it's got sugar in it, you can use Honeybee Healthy, it's got some apple cider vinegar in it, I believe, just to keep it from spoiling and going bad. But I'll do a batch of that and show you guys how I make it. It's malleable, so you can bend it. It's not a solid cake like a sugar cake where it would snap and break. And then you can just stuff it in there, and the bees throughout the entire winter, that cluster doesn't have to go very far to go up and take some of that fondant or sugar cake or whatever if they need the extra food. But it's going to be solid food, and they're going to have to use some water to kind of mix it up and turn it into kind of a syrup that they can consume. But again, you only really want to do that in the wintertime when temperatures really start consistently dropping. But that's really it. What's that been? 7 minutes? I can come out here, feed 4 hives relatively quickly, and just make sure, top them off, and they'll suck this down in about less than 24 hours. And every single one of these hives looked like the first one that I showed you. It just looked like a feeding frenzy, like when you throw blood in the water with sharks. I mean, they're going absolutely nuts over this stuff, which again is why it's so important to feed internally only, because if you were to put this sugar syrup and leave it open, or open feed anywhere near here, and I'm talking within like 500 feet of here, you will set off robbing. Even with the entrances closed down, as much as I have them closed down, you will set off robbing. The bees will go absolutely nuts over it. It has not rained here in forever. There is absolutely no food for them out there anywhere. There's pollen, but that's about it. They need the sugar. They need the nectar. There's no nectar anywhere. If I panned out in the field here, I showed you about a month ago where there was all this beautiful colored weeds out here that they could forage on. It looks like scorched earth out here. Everything is brown. It's dying. There's even the goldenrod looks miserable out here. So it's not a fun time to be a honeybee right now. So it's up to us as beekeepers to do our part to help our bees and to make sure that they are in the absolute best condition going into winter. And that means two primary things: lots of good food and nutrition, and dead mites. If you do not do what you're supposed to be doing with your mite treatments and killing mites, in Josh's humble opinion, you are shirking your duties as a beekeeper. And it's not just your apiary. You know, some may say, "Oh, well, if I end up losing a hive due to mites, so be it." That's all well and good, but your lack of mite control is also hurting your fellow beekeeper potentially. Because especially in a time like this when we're in a dearth, if robbing does happen to occur, or let's say there's some sort of community feeder out there, a beekeeper puts out a open feeds with sugar water somewhere out the open, and your bees interact with my bees, and your bees have phoretic Varroa mites on their back, and they hop onto my bees, you're spreading disease throughout my colonies now because you're not actively treating mites in your apiary. It is what it is. I just, in my personal opinion, I think being a good steward of honeybees is making sure that you do your part on mite treatment. The Varroa destructor mite is the single most devastating attacker for honeybees. It's public enemy number one, and we really have to do our parts to try to take care of the mites. I'm going to do a couple rounds of oxalic acid treatment on these hives. Again, that only goes after the phoretic mites, which are the mites that are actually attached onto the bee's back. But I'm going to hit these hives 2 or 3 rounds of oxalic acid vapor. Just again, it's not an excellent treatment, but it is one form of treatment for mite control, and it can just help knock those numbers down before you go into the wintertime. The jury's still out on whether or not you should use oxalic acid throughout the winter. There's studies out there that show that it can actually break the cluster and it can end up harming the bees because then they can't stay warm. So you wouldn't want to do it when temperatures are really cold. But if you get like one of those warm days throughout the winter, come out here and hit them with oxalic acid. The queen is already slowing down considerably on her laying, so there's not going to be as much brood as there is in the springtime. And if you stay consistent with the oxalic acid and frequent treatments, it can help reduce the mite count. It's not the best form of mite treatment, but you can add it to your arsenal of mite treatments to use, and that's what I use. I use that, I use the ApiGuard, and I've used Apivar, I've used others. So you just got to knock those mites down. It's extremely important going into the wintertime. It's every bit as important as food. I mean, it's like your car. You can't just put gasoline in it, you got to change the oil also. And so both are equally important. So anyway, that's really it. I'm going to go ahead and feed the other 6 hives out here, but I just kind of wanted to show you real quickly how easy it is with these Vivaldi boards and the setup that I have. You get you a little bucket if you have relatively few hives like I have, and you can come out here and you can just, systematically go through each hive, top them off. I will end up doing heft tests on each one of these, which is a fancy term for where I take the brick off the top, I lift up on the bottom of each one of these hives on the bottom board, and I can pretty much tell if the hive is heavy and has enough food in it or not. I'm also going to do one last final inspection through each of these hives before I go into the winter. I want to check their food stores. I want to check and make sure that the queen is still laying, that she's looking good. I see all signs of life, from fresh eggs to capped brood to larva. Everything looks good. You want that pearly white larva in there. And just make sure that I don't see any signs of pests or disease or small hive beetles, wax moth damage, anything along those lines. Any other final intervention that I need to do before I completely button these hives up for the winter, I need to go ahead and get that done now in the late fall time frame. So I'll be sure to take you guys along for that as well, just so you can kind of see what I do. I'll talk you through what I'm looking for, if I see any issues or any signs of disease or anything else. And then obviously tell you what I'm going to do to try to mitigate that. So it's getting really late in the year it's almost too late to do any splits. But if you have a really weak hive, you can combine it with a strong hive. That way that small hive is not trying to limp into the wintertime and end up perishing throughout the winter. So there's all sorts of intervention that we can do as beekeepers going into the final stretch here before we get into wintertime. And I'll be sure to take you guys along for the ride for that. So that's really it. Thanks again. I appreciate you guys watching.